Welcome back to Ultimate Reddit Drama. We're incredibly grateful for your support. Before we begin today's tale, tell us which city or country are you joining us from? We love connecting with our global audience. Now let's dive into today's story. James Morrison was holding the military duffel bag tightly in his hand. The whites of his fingers reflected the tension that hung over his mind and heart. The pain of missing 18 months, 3 months of deployment, and countless battles had changed him, but he never thought that standing at the door of his own house would make him feel so strange. As she made her way home, the innocent voice of her 5-year-old son Tommy echoed in the air. "Daddy is alive, but Mummy and Uncle Steve paid you to die." These words were no less than the explosion of a bomb. James had seen his brothers fall in the midst of a hail of bullets, ripping through the lines of enemies and coming out alive, but these words from his own son's mouth shook him to the core. The truth fell on him like lightning as he saw the face of his wife, Bethany, who was standing at the door. There was guilt in his eyes, but there was no trace of remorse in it. Behind her stood Steve, the same Steve, who had been her best friend, who had played football with her in high school, who had vowed with her before she enlisted in the army that they would always take care of each other. Now the same man stood with his hand on his wife's shoulder, as if this house and this family now belonged to him. "James, we can explain it," Steve said hesitantly. James said with a slight laugh, "Can you explain? Well then, explain. Explain how my wife believed the false news of my death? How did I teach my son that his real father is dead? And how did you two spend the insurance money in my name in luxury?" Nearby neighbors were now peeping through doors and windows. Seeing James, some people's eyes became moist, while some had guilt on their faces. "What we did was try to move on with your memories," Bethany said in a trembling voice. "With my memories?" James stepped forward, his voice now even colder. "So what did you do with my insurance money to move on with my memories? Visited Disneyland? Bought a new car? This designer bag you dropped was bought with the same money?" Steve's eyes began to escape, but Bethany's face still tried to clean up. "We were told you were killed, James," Bethany said. "We just did what felt right." "Which felt right?" James laughed. "Then I'm wrong, right?" An elderly woman came forward from the crowd, Mrs. Henderson, who had known James since he was a child. There was both pain and anger in his eyes. "We all shed tears in your farewell, son," he said, "and they didn't even look at it that they had any grief." James gently lifted his son in his arms. "Tommy, will you let me go?" The child nodded, but Bethany interrupted. "No, he will stay here. It's his home." There was no anger in James's eyes this time, just a cold calmness. "This is no longer my home, Beth," she said softly. "But what is mine, I will take back. That's the promise." James put Tommy in the car and drove away from the house. But there was a promise in his eyes, a promise that he would fulfill at any cost. James's car stopped in front of Mrs. Henderson's house. Tommy was still holding his drawing book, in which he drew a picture of his father, a soldier with a heavenly aura on him. "Daddy?" Tommy asked innocently. "Are you really back from heaven?" James's heart was broken inside. He stroked his little cheek lightly and said, "No, son, I never went. Your mom and Uncle Steve pretended like I was dead." Mrs. Henderson opened the door and hugged James. "I knew you'd be back, son." She took them in and, handing them hot coffee, said, "I've seen everything, James." Both of them gradually became so careless that they felt that no one would question them. Steve got a promotion to the insurance company, and he has betrayed many more military families in a similar way. James's ears perked up. "What do you mean? Did he cheat anyone other than me in this way?" "Yes," said Mrs. Henderson, placing a file on the table. "That's some of the evidence I've gathered. Many families were told the same story, that their loved ones had died, and insurance money was withdrawn. But in some cases, those soldiers were actually missing, not dead. A different fire now burned in James's eyes. So it wasn't just betraying me, it's an organized crime. Tommy picked up his drawing and said, "I made a new drawing, Daddy." James looked at him. This time, instead of the heavenly soldier, there was an older man holding a child, and behind them was a prison, in which two younger men were locked. "Who is this, Tommy?" "You and me, Daddy," said Tommy. "And there's Mummy and Uncle Steve in jail, because they lied." James hugged his son to his chest. "Yes, son, but you don't have to worry anymore. Now this fight is mine." He picked up the evidence on the table and said, "Now the game begins." James carefully read the evidence given by Mrs. Henderson. Every paper, every transcript, and every record was showing that Steve and his insurance company were running an organized scam. It wasn't just about the deception of James's wife. It was corruption pervading an entire system where money was being made in the name of soldiers. "I can't fight this case just for personal vendetta," James said quietly. "It has now become a fight for all the soldiers and their families who have been wronged." "So, what's your next step?" Mrs. Henderson asked. "First, I will find out who else is involved in this scam. I want a full network of Steve's connections. I will break the system from the inside, which is running this dirty game." Mrs. Henderson smiled. "You've always been a fighter, James. But remember, this battle has to be won legally." "Absolutely," James nodded. "I will knock them down by their own laws. But first, I need to gather some more evidence." He kissed Tommy affectionately and said, "Son, I'll go out for a while, but you'll be safe here, okay?" "All right, Daddy," said Tommy. "Are you going to put Mom and Uncle Steve in jail?" "Yes, son," James replied with a slight smile. "And not just them, but all those who have betrayed soldiers like us." James got in his car and started the engine. He knew that now he had nothing to lose but much to gain: his truth, his honor, and his son's future. Now, this fight is not just personal. It was a war against a system that was looting its own country's soldiers even after they were dead. James had been keeping an eye on Steve and Bethany's every move so far. She noticed that Steve had gotten involved in an even bigger game after his new promotion. He was no longer just faking the deaths of one or two soldiers, but he had made it a whole business. "This man is not just my enemy," James told his colleague Frank, who was once in the FBI and now helping him expose corruption. "It is the enemy of every soldier who is serving the country by putting his life at stake." "So what do you intend to do?" Frank asked. "I will trap them in their own tricks. They think they're invincible so far, but they don't think that the man they buried could come back." James sent a fake client inside Steve's insurance company, a soldier whose death process had been initiated. Frank and his team tracked that process and recorded every paper, every transaction. "That's the whole network," said Frank when he found out that it involved not just Steve, but also several government officials, bank officials, and top executives of insurance companies. "Now we just have to deliver a big blow," James said. "What blow?" "Public embarrassment," James replied coldly. "They think they are safe in the corridors of power, but when the public sees their real faces, no one will come to their rescue." Frank smiled. "You really are a soldier, James. You don't just have to have a gun, you have a brain to win the battle." "There's only one last step left," James said, staring at Bethany and Steve's bank account details in his hand. "Now this game is going to end." But Steve and Bethany still didn't know that their worst enemy was still alive, and he was ready to wipe them out completely. James knew that he had to choose the right time and the right place for one last blow. He was patient for months, carefully planning every move. Now the time had come when Steve and Bethany were implicated in their own tricks. "You've got everything set?" he asked Frank, who was staring at his laptop screen. "Yes, we have tracked all their bank transactions. Steve's insurance company has committed a $30 million fraud this year alone. All the evidence is ready. It's just a matter of giving a blow," Frank replied. "This blow will be huge," James said coldly. He had a secret plan. He was about to make his entry at a big gala event, the event where Steve and Bethany had invited a lot of big people. There they were celebrating their newfound success, but little did they know that the celebration was going to turn into their ruin. Rich businessmen, politicians, and media people were present everywhere at the gala event. Bethany was walking around in an expensive gown, and Steve was proudly talking about his insurance company's success. "We're here today to honor the soldiers who gave their lives," Steve announced as he stood on stage. "We have expanded our institution to support their widows and children." The crowd applauded. But just then, a video suddenly started playing on the big screen in the hall. The screen showed Steve and Bethany's bank transfer records, files of false insurance claims, and evidence of their secret transactions. The whole hall was stunned. Steve and Bethany's faces flushed. "What's going on?" Bethany whispered. But it was too late. "It's your day of ruin," James said as he stepped on stage. The whole hall looked back at him. "I thought I was dead, but actually, I was alive to reveal your real truth to the world." FBI agents entered from all around the stage. "Steve Russell, you are arrested on charges of insurance fraud, falsification of government documents, and defrauding soldiers' families," one agent declared. Steve tried to escape, but then Frank and other agents caught him. "You don't know what you're doing," shouted Steve. "No, Steve," James said, stepping forward. "You don't know what you did. You took advantage of my death, got my wife with you, and tried to take my son away from me. But now, your truth has been revealed to everyone." The people in the crowd were now looking at Steve and Bethany with disgust. The same people he wanted to put in his pocket were now running away from him. "Bethany Morrison," a female agent went on, "you are arrested on charges of cheating and conspiracy." Bethany looked at James, crying. "James, please, it's all a misunderstanding." But there was no expression on James's face. "You thought I was dead, Bethany. But look, I'm back, and this time you will have to be gone from my life forever." As FBI agents put Steve and Bethany in handcuffs and took them out, James took a deep breath. The battle was long, but he had finally won. There was an awkward silence in the gala hall. People still couldn't understand what happened in front of them. The man whom they had respected as a warrior had been exposed before their eyes as a disgusting traitor. Steve and Bethany's screams could still be heard in the distance, but to James they were just words dissolved in the air, without any meaning. "Is it all true?" a man in the crowd asked in a low voice. "Yes," Frank confirmed, "and this evidence is just the beginning." James took out another file from his pocket and tossed it at the media reporters. "These are the names of all the soldiers who were declared dead, but whose deaths were never confirmed. Steve and his gang did the same not just to me, but to the families of 23 other soldiers." Reporters immediately took out their cameras and microphones. "So does that mean these soldiers can be alive?" a reporter asked excitedly. "There's a possibility," Frank said, "and now the government is going to investigate this whole matter thoroughly. We will do everything possible to get justice for those families." There was sudden applause from among the people. It was the same people who had been praising Steve and Bethany a few minutes earlier, but now they understood who the real hero was. James bowed his head and looked at the crowd. He didn't stop for applause. He just wanted to make sure that the fight was completely over. But there was one last thing left. Tommy. He hurried out, where FBI cars were parked ready to take Steve and Bethany. "Just a minute," he said in a stern voice. "I need to talk to my son." The FBI agents looked at each other, then nodded in agreement. "Bethany," said James sternly. "Where's Tommy?" Bethany, now completely broken, sobbed, "At school. We had to go pick him up." James ran towards the car without saying a word. He knew that Steve and Bethany could make their last move, use Tommy to run away with them, and he wanted to stop it at all costs. On the way, Frank gave an update on the radio. "The security of the school has been alerted, but we have to arrive quickly." James increased the speed of the car. When they arrived at the school, everything was quiet. But James's heart was pounding. She asked the guard, "Where's Tommy Morrison?" The guard replied a little nervously, "A few minutes ago, his mother came to pick him up." James's blood boiled. "Where did you go?" he asked with a roar. The guard quickly checked the security camera footage and showed it on the screen, Bethany holding Tommy by the hand and leading him out of the school. "Stop him!" shouted James and ran. Bethany and Tommy were in the school parking lot, and Bethany was trying to get him into the car. But just then, Tommy looked back at James and his eyes lit up. "Dad! Tommy, come to me!" Tommy hesitated for a while, but as soon as he saw the panic in Bethany's eyes, he understood that something was not right. "No, I want to go to Dad!" shouted Tommy and ran into James's arms. Bethany tried to catch him, but then FBI agents arrived and stopped him there. "Your game is over, Bethany," said one of the agents sternly. Bethany sat on the ground and began to cry, but no one seemed to pity her anymore. James hugged Tommy tightly. "It's all right, son. No one can take you away from me now." Tommy looked at her. "Will we be together forever now?" James's eyes moistened. "Yes, now always." James put Tommy in his car and looked at him softly. There was a storm of questions in Tommy's innocent eyes, but right now he just felt safe with his father. "Will Mommy go to jail too?" Tommy asked in a low voice. James took a deep breath. "Yes, son. They will have to face the consequences of what they did." Tommy was silent for a moment, then said softly, "But Mummy told me you'd never come back. They lied, didn't they?" James's eyes looked painful, but he looked at his son with a smile. "Yes, son. He lied. But I was always there for you and always will be." There was a relaxed silence in the car. Tommy gently grabbed James's hand, and James held him in his firm grip. A few hours later, James was in his new home, a simple, safe place where he had prepared a special room for Tommy. He wanted his son to never feel insecure again. "So, what do we do today?" James laughed. Tommy thought for a while and then said, "Can we make pizza together?" James laughed. "Absolutely, son." They both went to the kitchen, and Tommy started decorating the pizza toppings with great enthusiasm. For the first time, James felt like he had indeed found his son back. But the battle was not over yet. On the other side, at the FBI office, Frank and his team were preparing all the evidence into a final report. "We're sure Steve and Bethany weren't alone. They had a whole team that was running this fraud," Frank said. "So what's the next step now?" an agent asked. "We will catch every member of this gang. No one will survive." Meanwhile, James got a call from Frank. "You'll be happy to know that this wasn't just limited to Steve and Bethany. We have more names," Frank said. James thought for a moment and then said sternly, "I want us to catch every culprit. I want no soldier to be caught in a situation like mine again." Frank replied with a smile, "That's what we're supposed to do, buddy. That's what we're going to do." The next morning, Tommy had breakfast with James for the first time without fear or confusion. But there were still many questions swirling in James's mind. He decided that it was not enough to send Bethany and Steve to jail, but that the entire fraud network had to be dismantled. "Tommy, what's going to happen at school today?" James asked with a smile. Tommy happily replied, "We're starting a new science project today. I want to write about truth and justice, just like you did." James looked at his son proudly. "It's a great topic, son. Truth and justice are always most important." After dropping Tommy off at school, James went straight to Frank's office, where the operation was in its final stages. "We've got a list of his entire team," Frank said, handing the file to him. "Not just Bethany and Steve, but people inside the insurance company, government officials, and their foreign contacts are also involved." "How long can we act on them?" James asked. "No more delays. We're going to take down the entire network in one fell swoop," Frank confidently replied. On the other side, Bethany was sitting behind the harsh bars of the prison. His face was tired and his eyes were red. She never thought she would be in this condition. "I can't stay here," she told her lawyer. "Get me out of it." The lawyer replied coldly, "You don't have much choice, Mrs. Russell. If you cooperate, perhaps your sentence may be reduced." "Cooperation?" Bethany asked suspiciously. "If you name the rest of the members of this fraud network, you may receive a lesser sentence," the lawyer explained. Bethany's eyes were full of fear. He understood that he had no support left. Frank and James's team was ready. The FBI and military intelligence jointly planned a major operation. Over the next few hours, raids were scheduled to take place in different parts of the country. "Are you ready?" Frank asked James. "I'm always ready," James replied coldly. He was no longer just a soldier. He had become an instrument of justice. Steve was sitting in front of his lawyer, his face looking more tense than ever. He never thought that things could go so wrong. "We can file an appeal, but the evidence is so strong that there is no way for you to escape," said the lawyer, glancing at the paperwork. "Is there no way out?" Steve said with a shrug. "If you give the names of the rest of the people, the sentence can be reduced," the lawyer suggested. Steve's mind was in turmoil. The people with whom he had played such a big game could no longer get him out of trouble. If he called them names, they wouldn't leave him. And if he doesn't, he'll rot in jail for the rest of his life. James sat on the other side of his house, watching news reports. There was no expression on his face, but there was peace inside his mind. Both Bethany and Steve were in jail, but that was just the beginning. "Dad," came Tommy, his eyes twinkling. "My science project report came out the best." James smiled and patted her on the head. "I'm proud of you, son. And yes, I wrote in my project that the truth never hides, no matter how hard one tries." James's eyes moistened slightly. His son had understood what adults fail to understand. Frank's phone rang. "We're ready," she said. "Let's put a real end to this game," James replied with a sigh. He picked up his jacket and headed for the door. A new battle awaited him outside. A battle he had to fight for his brothers, for his son, and for all the soldiers whose honor these traitors had snatched. The day of judgment had arrived. That morning was like no other day. There was a huge crowd of journalists, victims' families, and the general public outside the court. Everyone was waiting for the verdict of this historic trial, which shook the entire nation. Inside, amidst the grand walls of the court, the judge was about to recite the last lines of his judgment. There was silence in the whole room. All eyes were on the judge, especially the two men, Bethany and Steve, who were about to pronounce their sentences. "Stand up, everyone," echoed the court official's voice. The judge slid his glasses up a bit and began to read the verdict with pause. This court, after taking into account all the evidence presented and the testimony of witnesses, found that Steve Russell and Bethany Russell committed the grave crime of organized fraud, misappropriation of military benefits, and erasing the identity of an innocent person. This is a gross violation of the basic principles of the judicial system. As soon as he read the verdict, there was a stir in the court. There was a look of satisfaction on the faces of the victims' families, but the lines of fear and remorse on the faces of Bethany and Steve were deepening. The judge hit his hammer on the table and pronounced the final verdict. Steve Russell is sentenced to 25 years, and Bethany Russell to 15 years. Every dollar illegally grabbed by them will be returned to the victims' families. Applause erupted inside and outside the courtroom. People came up to James and thanked him. It wasn't just his fight. It was the battle of all the soldiers who were betrayed and given money to their families for their wrongful deaths. Bethany and Steve were being carried away in handcuffs. Bethany looked at James for the last time, tears in her eyes. But it was not tears of remorse. It was the fear of losing the life she had received through betrayal. James didn't respond. She took a deep breath and looked at Tommy, who was smiling at her. Her son was now the basis of a new beginning in her life. He stepped forward and picked up Tommy in his arms. Let's go home now, son. Tommy nodded, his innocent eyes gleaming with contentment and security. For James, this was not just a legal battle. It was a battle for his self-esteem, his survival, and his son's future. He endured the most difficult days of his life, lived even when he accepted his death, and saved his truth even in the darkness of deception. Bethany and Steve's conviction had not fully set him free, but he now knew that the steps he had taken for justice would serve as an example for generations to come. James and Tommy walked out of court. There was a light breeze, the sun was shining in the sky. It was a new day and a new beginning in his life. James grabbed Tommy's hand and moved on to his new life. A life with no deception or deceit. Just a true story of a father and son who could fight against any difficulty and win.